How to make a vintage Basset-Lowke steam plant work again. Part 8, making the mahogany mounting base and painting the pump. Last week a very kind viewer called in to see me. He was in the area and he brought me a suitcase full of mahogany. This mahogany is around 70 years old and it really is very stable, and he gave me a great variety of different sizes. Once again, thanks for that, Terry, it's really good stuff. I've cut some of the broader pieces to length and now I'm using PVA adhesive to join the parts together. I don't normally use PVA adhesive for a couple of reasons. One is it takes a long time to dry, and the other reason that I seldom use PVA in the workshop is it also leaves a white residue on top of the wood that can be difficult to sand away. PVA is a very good adhesive for doing this kind of thing. Normally I use cyanoacrylate adhesive or CA glue or super glue, because I like the speed that it sets at and it's generally very strong, but for this application PVA is better. PVA is more shockproof than cyano adhesive. And before the last plank covers it up, you will notice that I'm using a cast iron surface plate. This will make sure that the finished board is very flat. You will also notice that I'm taking great pains to make sure that there's plenty of adhesive, not too much, but that there's full coverage on the edges of these pieces of wood. Normally for these kind of jobs I would use a piece of plywood and then veneer the plywood, but this is just a different way of doing it. And the other good thing, of course, is you don't get it all over your hands like you do with cyano adhesive, and if you do, it's water soluble, so it washes off easily. These clamps were given to me a long time ago by a good friend of mine who still works in the business, and his claim to fame is he was once the drummer with Mark Bolan and T-Rex. Only for a short while, but that's quite good to have on your CV, I suppose. So thanks, Paul. The clamps did come in useful after all these years. I'm making sure that the mahogany planks are perfectly straight, at least down one side of them. When I finally get the planks straight and tighten up the clamps, I'll lift up the entire assembly to wipe off the surplus adhesive, although it's not really going to stick to the surface plate because the surface plate is cast iron anyway. I suppose it would have made more sense to put a polythene sheet on top of the surface plate first, but this PVA adhesive is very easy to wipe off everywhere just using a wet cloth. Even though the planks are clamped together, there's a little bit of movement, so to ensure that I ended up with a flat board, I put a piece of steel on top of the mahogany and then lots of random pieces of steel on top of that. Thanks to the miracle of digital video, 24 hours has elapsed. Now it's time to remove the weights and the clamps and see how strong the board is. And the good news is the board is perfectly flat, thanks to it being on a surface plate. The water content of the adhesive has made the surface plate a bit rusty, but a bit of Scotch-Brite removed that. Then I sanded the board thoroughly on my horizontal belt sander, followed by sanding it some more with an orbital sander and finishing it off with another piece of Scotch-Brite. This is not the same piece that I used for cleaning up the surface plate. And now it's time to varnish the board. I don't want the board to look really shiny, so I apply the varnish with a cloth, and I need to buy some more varnish because the varnish in my tin is getting a bit thick and gloopy now, so I've had to dilute it a little bit with some white spirit. My new workshop lamp makes it really easy to do this because I always have a very bright light right on the surface of where I'm working. There now follows some painting. I'm going to paint this small hand pump. The pump is temporarily held in place to the base just using one bolt. One of the threads in this casting is more or less stripped, so I'm going to drill it all the way through when I fit the pump to the baseboard, and then I propose to use two long countersunk bolts with nuts on to hold the entire assembly to the main wooden baseboard. This is a plastic cap that I've just taken off the top of my tin of etch primer, and in this clip I'm spraying some etch primer out of the aerosol into the cap. It's Phoenix Paints etch primer, and it's horrible stuff to spray anyway. I mentioned it to Phil at Blackgates and he filled me in on a few details, and he said, "You need a very thin coat of this stuff. It isn't a regular primer, it's an etch primer, then you need to spray it with ordinary primer to finish it off." I'm not going to bother doing that with this pump, I'm just going to paint it with black paint. It's obviously a different kind of primer entirely to the stuff that we use at the steam workshop. Their primer just sprays like an ordinary aerosol, whereas this primer just splatters all over the work, but then all the little dots that you've just splattered all over your work suddenly join up into one perfect finish. Apparently, if you apply too much of this type of etch primer, you can get bubbles underneath the etch primer as the acid in the etch primer eats its way into the metal slightly. You live and learn. I really did wonder about that because every time I tried to paint with it, I got the worst finish in the world, and I went away and then I came back and it was fine. Because this is such a small part, it really wasn't worth spraying it, so I'm just going to paint it with a brush. The last video that I made was about the reassembly of the Chubb locomotive at the steam workshop. I showed how I used a piece of tissue paper to push into the end of a socket to support the bolt or a nut so it didn't go all the way down into the socket. And of course, a viewer had to say, I'd just use a Dremel and grind off the end of the socket. And I thought to myself, well, yes, if I did that, that would be a good idea too, but unfortunately, on these very small sockets and nut spinners, if you do that, whenever you want to put a nut onto a bolt that is a bit longer than the end of the nut, you're going to struggle. And the viewer went on to say that he uses axle grease to hold the nuts and bolts into the end of his nut spinner. Well, that's okay as well, but then you're going to get axle grease all over the end of the nut, and when you touch it in with the paintbrush, it's not going to really like being painted over because it's covered in axle grease. The reason I started making all these videos in the first place was to give free help and information to viewers. And these days, because I do it in such a high volume, any financial support via Patreon or paypal.me is very much appreciated. Anyway, as I was just saying, I've been doing this sort of thing for many, many years. I don't make any wild claims about being a good machinist or an engineer. As I've said many times, I'm a musician. So when I offer this advice on the videos, the advice is based on many years of experience, and it's the way that I do it. And in my opinion, it's generally a simple way of doing it. And if it's not the simplest way, it's probably the quickest, because I don't like to waste too much time. Because time is something we're all running out of. And that's about it for this episode. I'm going to finish off with the engine running. It's running on compressed air. And some viewers say, can you turn up the sound of your engines running? Well, they don't make much noise. The sound on this clip is really turned up. When I stop speaking, you'll hear it. So thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful.